Okay, good evening to all of you. Good evening, Captain Vijay Kumar. Once again, thank you for the invitation to come back here again. Really appreciate and great to be back here and addressing all of you, those in the room and those online. After the overview of what's happening in China that Frank has given, I'm going to turn to the main findings of our research. Last time when I was here 6 months ago, we sort of shared with you what we were planning to do, and now what I would like to share with you is what have we found, and we'd like to get your feedback and get your thoughts on what you think, hopefully whether this is going to be useful for the private sector, for India, for the government, etc. So just to give you a quick background, our work is grounded in 50 structured interviews that we conducted under Chatham House rules, so hopefully that allowed honest conversations with C-suite executives across manufacturing and service sectors. They covered global companies, Indian companies, and Chinese companies. We also spoke to senior policymakers. We complemented what we found in these interviews with quantitative data from India, from China, and from other China Plus One markets. So the central thesis of my presentation, this is kind of the climax of the movie, India is not replacing China, but it is becoming a strategic complement in global firms' China Plus One strategies. So this is essentially portfolio diversification on the part of companies, not a decoupling from China. Okay. So let's actually, to put us all on the same page, define what China Plus One actually means. It emerged in the early 2000s as firms diversified as labor costs rose in China, and they wanted risk exposure to be diversified from coastal China. But it exploded after 2018 with the beginning of the US-China trade war, the export controls, COVID-19 factory stoppages that we've heard of, supply chain and currency weaponization. These were all geopolitics were the driving factors. And single country dependencies became national security issues and became supply chain liabilities. So the outcome is a portfolio strategy to diversify supply chains, adding resilience, not isolation, but adding resilience, adding redundancy, and adding optionality while keeping significant China presence. So it's not about decoupling, it's about strategic rebalancing, establishing additional manufacturing or sourcing bases in complementary locations. So crucially for most firms, the goal is not China replacement, but looking at multi-node production and sourcing networks that include India. So China remains critical for its many issues, some of them Frank touched on, R&D sophistication and its massive domestic market. For example, Apple still derives nearly 20% of its revenue from China. So the opportunity is important for India because global boardrooms are now looking at resilience alongside cost and market access. So this raises two issues for India. First, attracting China Plus One investments from global firms to India. And second, and this is required for India to meet its own development and economic growth objectives, Viksit Bharat 2047. We would all like that has a strong China component involved in it. And the second factor is diversifying sourcing dependence for India away from China. So those are two issues that matter for India. So, but why does India matter for global firms? And India matters because of its scale, because of its talent, and because of its policy traction. So it's a 1.4 billion domestic market, rivaling China's. Median age is 29, China's is 41. Several of our interviewees told us that India's scale justifies capex investments that smaller nations simply cannot support for its own domestic market. India produces 2.5 million STEM graduates annually. We know that there are issues with varying quality, but this is still a major strength. And India also has a large and vibrant startup ecosystem. The production-linked incentives, PLI schemes, seem to be delivering. Electronics components have surged, as was mentioned by Manoj, and from near zero to about $25 billion. Dozens of factories. Apple's story is, of course, well known. We have a representative sitting right here. The pharma is another. Some respondents told us that PLI made the difference between pilot and scale. And of course, PLI has its share of critics, we know that, but on the ground, it is attracting investments. So, India also uniquely supports a Made in India for India strategy, where its middle-class consumers justify capacity without export reliance, and selective export growth in certain sectors. So it also supports targeting competitive exports of what we call good enough products. So products to other developing countries, products to Africa, products to Latin America, where the consumers may be more price sensitive and not just high spec products to developed markets. So unlike smaller Asian alternatives in the China Plus One strategy of global firms, India offers both production scale and market demand. So other destinations, for example, Vietnam, they may be geared towards optimizing exports, but India de-risks with home consumption. And no other China Plus One destination actually matches what India can offer. But that said, here is a trade-off that investors are weighing, global investors are weighing. China, as was mentioned earlier, has unmatched mature ecosystem, some of the world's best infrastructure, but it has rising labor costs, 20%, 30% or more wage premium versus India. Geopolitical tensions that we all know about, they are driving many global firms to diversify from China. Many Chinese firms have their own China Plus One strategies. They are also going out of China and moving into other China Plus One destinations, for example, ASEAN. So even though the primary driver in their cases may be tariff arbitrage now, it was cost earlier, maybe tariff arbitrage now. So if you look at Vietnam as another possibility, another very attractive destination for China Plus One, it's got export-focused efficiency, improving logistics, but it's a mid-sized market. Its GDP is about a tenth of India, roughly speaking. Capacity constraints are already emerging in Vietnam in ports and logistics as it absorbs a lot of FDI since 2020. Thailand, it has a stable automotive industrial hub, strong regional integration, moderate costs, but a similarly mid-sized market and less demographic dividend than India has. So India stands out. Primary role as huge, access to a huge market, very large scale, positive demographics, and strong domestic demand. So all of this said, where does India fall short then in the scheme of things when people are assessing China Plus One destinations? All our interviewees shared considerable frustration in several areas, and some of you may share that. First, the well-known bureaucratic complexity across both central and state government levels, and this is despite government trying to improve the ease of doing business over many, many years. Some infrastructure issues, just as in some examples. Industrial electricity, on paper, if you compare per unit, per megawatt costs actually compare similar to that in China, but that's only on paper. Actually, actual experience costs are much higher for businesses in India for a variety of reasons, including creating backup capacity, etc., and that can lead to power costs 20% or more higher than China. Logistics costs. The government of India, DPIIT, has released a report that says that India's logistics costs are 8% of GDP, 7.97 to be precise. China has released a report saying its logistics costs are 13.5% of GDP. I will leave it at that in terms of what it is that the experienced cost in India is, what India is saying and what China is saying. So clearly the experienced cost in India on logistics is much higher than what we see as reported. Interviews also told us compliance costs are substantial, and some of you here who lead industry, who lead businesses may agree. There's also geographic concentration risk. 60% of India's FDI comes into 4 states, Maharashtra, Karnataka, Gujarat, Tamil Nadu, right here. Single window approval systems, reliable power, cleared land, pre-cleared land banks. These are just examples of issues where there is enormous unevenness across states. And as a corollary, ecosystem development is also uneven across these 4 and many of the other states. In order to develop advanced manufacturing skills, supply chain depth, development, etc., takes 5+ years, as many respondents told us, sometimes even a decade, even with a lot of focus. Some of the early Korean entrants into Tamil Nadu invested a decade or more building up their supply chains. Batteries and EVs could take as much or longer today. So there needs to be a realism in terms of time horizon as to what you can accomplish in India. So these are some of the considerations that businesses are thinking about when they look at India as a China +1 destination. And we can't really wish these away. Execution and policy gaps you can actually quantify. So India is chosen as a China +1 destination when firms need a second node serving a large domestic market, which has the potential to improve its resilience, and the companies can deepen their supply chains over time. India is not chosen because it is the cheapest alternative to China, to be very clear about that. But on the other hand, while Vietnam might win on short-term assembly, India is positioned for decades-long growth, and this is what attracts firms. So India's job now essentially is to convert this market access into long-term manufacturing strength. So what did we find in our research? First, India is benefiting from China +1. That's a very clear message. It is benefiting, but substantially less than what it could, substantially less than what it could get. And the gap is quite significant. Just to give you put some numbers on this, India attracted $81 billion of FDI in 24-25, almost all of it from non-Chinese firms. So as a comparison, ASEAN, and just to put picture, the 10 countries across the ASEAN group, roughly the same GDP as India, half the population, attracted 3 times the GDP, 3 times the FDI. Okay, so half the population, roughly the same GDP overall, 3 times the FDI. And China is now the largest investor in ASEAN. So as I mentioned, Chinese firms have their own China +1 strategy. They are investing in ASEAN. And now China invests 3 times as much in ASEAN as the traditional leaders, US, Korea, and Japan used to. So it's very, very big, the move out, or at least diversification from China into ASEAN as a China +1 destination by Chinese firms. If you look at firms that are headquartered in the OECD countries, the rich countries, they invest pre-COVID, they would invest twice as much in China as they invested in ASEAN. In 5 years, they invest 2.5 times now more in ASEAN than they invest in China. It's flipped completely in 5 years' time. So when you look at the firms that are headquartered in the OECD countries. So this just give you a scale of the gap between what India could and what India is attracting. So, but that said, India is clearly on the map for global firms looking for an additional base alongside China. So the interest of global investors is there, the investment activity is there too, but the conversion rate from interest to large-scale sustained investment is still too low. Now, what we also found was sectors, the firm's strategies are very sector specific, and this might be obvious to many of you who run businesses. A pharmaceuticals firm thinks very differently from an electronics firm, thinks very differently from a services firm. Each faces very different issues, very different constraints, very different opportunities. So these have to be assessed at a very micro level as far as China +1 investments are concerned. The other finding, across the board, companies looking to India as a China +1 destination find the made in India for India model as a genuine strength. They look at India's growing middle class, they look at India's high consumption to GDP ratio, and it makes it attractive to these firms to invest in India even without exports. Another finding, state level governance and execution matter as much as national policy. Investment is very local, even if it may be for either the national or the global market. So it's very critical, the state level governance and execution. And again and again and again, we heard the same thing from businesses across our interviews. China dependence for India remains inevitable in the medium term. There is no way we are getting out from our economic relationship with China. For most firms, especially electronics, automotive, complex manufacturing, China remains central for components, for supplier ecosystems, and for the domestic market. So the realistic question for India at the policy level is not, can India replace China? It cannot. Not in the next decade, for sure, probably not even for longer. But it is, can India become the most credible complement to China in the global supply chains? And there the answer is yes, it can, subject to a long list of things. And we'll come to some of those. So geopolitics clearly shapes the context, but like the trade war, technology controls, etc., all of these push firms to diversify. But the important thing to keep in mind for the Indian policymakers in particular is when executives sit down to make their investment decisions, the primary drivers are still cost, speed, reliability, access to talent. Geopolitics is an accelerator. It's not the only engine that drives investments. So, just to conclude this slide, India is not a replacement for China. It is a strategic complement, and this is in a world where the firms need both. So how are firms adapting in India? In basically four ways is what we found in our research. They start with assembly in India and then deepen localization later. So for example, some of the Apple started with assembly, now it's around 20% local value addition, aiming for about 30 to 40% over the next 5 years. Similar thing as an experience for some of the large Korean manufacturers that came in much earlier. Second, corporate strategy has evolved from cost efficiency to resilience. So firms are now using basically multi-sourcing to balance resilience, cost, and market access. And nearly 2/3 of the firms that we spoke to are implementing these multi-sourcing strategies. And interestingly, some firms told us they base themselves, for them, exporting to Africa from Chennai is cheaper than shipping goods from here to Delhi. So therefore, they are even looking at different, setting up different facilities in different parts of India to diversify risk and lower their own costs across the Indian market itself. So that's one in terms of looking at corporate strategies. Companies also rely on local partnerships via joint ventures to navigate Indian regulation and to navigate execution risk. Firms are also tailoring products. They are tailoring products for India. They are tailoring products to be made in India for other emerging markets, for other developing countries, and they're not doing it just copying whatever they are doing it in China. They are tailoring products for these markets. And given their price and the price sensitivity of these markets. So many companies are looking at India as a base to export good enough products to other developing markets. So the most common pattern is that firms are beginning with a made in India for India strategy, and then later on they are moving into exports either to developed markets or to good enough products for the other emerging markets. So on the basis of all these findings, what should policy actually do? Our first set of recommendations is about balancing protection and competitiveness. So in 2020, India for investment from China, India released Press Note 3. There was COVID, there was Galwan. They are very understandable response at the time. But 2 months ago, in March, India moved to a much more targeted risk-based system, investments only above a 10% beneficial ownership, or those involving control, trigger screening. There's a fast-track 60-day mechanism for certain key sectors. So this shift in our view is important. And just to let you know, our research was completed before March 10th. So had this talk been before March 10th, we would have had exactly the same recommendations. Strongly supports what India is doing. ring fence genuinely sensitive sectors, open up more in non-strategic areas, attract capital, technology and capability, and send a signal to the world that you don't close down and you can manage security concerns in a way while keeping yourself open to these, to capital, technology and capability. So this is sort of on the press note 3 issue, which has been a significant factor in the India-China relations. But beyond press note 3, there's a much broader competitiveness agenda. If India wants to anchor more China plus one investments, it has to address cost disadvantages, especially power and logistics. There is no getting away from that, and continuing to simplify a regulatory environment. So the message basically is calibrated openness plus lower operating frictions. It's a powerful tool to attract more investments. The second set of recommendations focuses on institutions and implementation. So we've seen how FDI is concentrated in 4 states, 60% in 4 states. So that tells us 2 things. One, national framework is important, but also state level governance and capacity are decisive. So we argue for 3 priorities in this area. First, expand and strengthen single window approval systems and make them really credible. So what investors fear most is not tax rates, but uncertainty and delays. So if the 21-day approvals that we see here in Tamil Nadu can actually become a standard across the country, India's best practice is available in India itself. It doesn't need to look in any other country. So India's attractiveness to China plus one investment rises sharply. Build supplier ecosystems through targeted support. Right now, PLI supports volume and capacity. At some point, PLI needs, and it has been successful in doing that. But should the objectives remain the same, or should the objectives of PLI themselves evolve into supporting deeper value addition, into supporting deeper supply chain creation and local supplier development? So these are the kind of things that policy needs to think about, looking at the future of PLI, and and understanding the fact that these things take a long time to develop for firms that are coming here. And the third is diffuse the FDI-friendly environment beyond the 4-star states. Looking at state-level benchmarking, use competitive federalism, publish comparable metrics for actual approval times, infrastructure quality, contract enforcement, name and shame kind of thing, and hopefully that might drive more competition among states. So the bottom line here is how India implements policy at the state level will determine whether China plus one benefits are concentrated in a few states or are truly broad-based across India. The third pillar of our recommendations is trade strategy, and this links India tightly